Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Cardinal.
It's a great joy for all of us to be here today to inaugurate the new home of the Brotherhood of Hope. And it gives me an opportunity to publicly acknowledge and thank the brothers for the wonderful ministry that they do for us here in the diocese and campus ministry and seminary. And of course, I'm very grateful for all of the help that Brother Bob Oliver gives me in Rome, which is doing yeoman's work over there. In the first reading from the Book of Wisdom, we read, God does not make death, but it was by the envy of the devil that death entered the world. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve tried to find happiness their own way rather than God's way. They did not trust in what God had told them. And when the devil convinces us not to live the way that God tells us to live, we find death. The two miracles in today's gospel show us what can happen when people put their trust in Jesus. The gospel takes place in Capharnaum, near the synagogue and near St. Peter's house, which I call the original Apostolic Palace, Elias Domus Santa Marta. Next week, when you take off for the Holy Land without me, I hope that you get to Capharnaum. In my Chrism Mass homily this year, I urge my priest to live with 1 foot in Nazareth and 1 foot in Capharnaum. There you will see the synagogue where Jesus gave the beautiful discourse on the Eucharist in chapter 6 of St. John's Gospel, and where today's cures took place. I wonder if Jairus was always an admirer of Jesus, or whether, as head of the synagogue, he felt superior to Jesus, and perhaps resented Jesus' popularity and his influence over the people. Obviously, his little daughter's health allowed him to put aside whatever pride or vanity he had to seek Jesus' help. The Gospel says, falling at Jesus' feet, he pleaded that Jesus come and cure his daughter. Jesus set out immediately with Jairus, but he's then pursued by this woman with her hemorrhages. The Gospel shows us that Jesus' life is pulled in 1,000 directions, and Jesus' life in many ways is like ours, that is made up of 1,000 interruptions. Mark tells us that this woman was afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. Not only was this a debilitating condition, but it also rendered her, according to Jewish law, ritually unclean, which would have prevented her from a normal life of marriage and children and participating in the life of the synagogue and the life of the community of believers. Now, Jewish women, even today, often hesitate to shake the hand of a rabbi because observant Jewish women will not touch a rabbi. So when Jesus says, "Who touched me?" this poor woman was in a flight mode. She approached in fear and trembling, realizing that she had been cured. She fell down before Jesus, and she tells him the whole story. I'm sure she told him about all those doctors, too. How much they cost, and how little good they did for her. It's curious that this appears in all the Synoptic Gospels, and all of them give this indictment of the doctors except St. Luke, who was a physician himself. So he was more respectful to doctors. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you." Jesus addresses her with affection. He doesn't say, "Listen, lady," or "ma'am." He says, "Daughter." And he assures her that her faith has saved her. The same faith that inspired her to touch Jesus' cloak. Suddenly the 12 years of suffering seemed worth it. She had met Jesus. She believed. She was cured. She was saved. All the money she wasted on the charlatan doctors doesn't seem to matter anymore. All of a sudden, nothing matters. Only faith, only life, only Jesus. Having finished with the interruption, Jesus continues on his way, and he arrives at Jairus' house. Like getting a kick in the stomach, they tell Jairus, "Your daughter's dead." She was 12 years old. How old are you, dear?
13.
13. About that age. What a terrible news for the father. Your daughter is dead. Maybe he felt anger at that woman with the bleeding who delays Jesus. But before he could react, Jesus says, "Do not be afraid. Have faith." It always comes back to faith. Jesus went into the house. He didn't allow anyone to accompany him except Peter, James, and John. These apostles were Jesus' inner circle. They're the same three that accompanied Jesus on Mount Tabor for the Transfiguration. There they glimpsed Jesus' glory, his inner splendor. At Jairus' house, they saw Jesus' power, not just to cure, but his power over life and death. The same three, Peter, James, and John, also get ringside seats at Gethsemane, where Jesus called them forward to be close to him. Where they can see Jesus rolling on the ground, crying out, "Father, let this chalice pass from me," over and over again. They could see how in his anxiety, Jesus was sweating blood. At times, Jesus allows us to glimpse his glory so that we can endure the scandal of the cross. In today's gospel, Mark describes the wake. Wakes vary very much from culture to culture. I always tell the story that when I was bishop in Fall River, I went to an Irish wake with my Portuguese priest secretary. When we walked into the home, they immediately put a plate of food and a glass of drink in each of our hands. And Father Steve said, "Is there a corpse here?" I said, "It's right behind you." He looked, he said, "You Irish are savages." He was more used to the Portuguese wakes where people would sit around dressed in black, weeping and praying the rosary. Well, the Jews were more like the Portuguese, more tears and more crying. Jesus said, "Why all this commotion? The girl is asleep, not dead." For the believer, death is a fiction. It's rather like a sleep that allows us to awaken in eternity, which is reality, the really real. Jesus entered the room with the girl's parents and the three apostles. There, following a very tender scene, Jesus took her hand. By Jewish law, he should not have touched a corpse. It was forbidden. And Jesus says, "Talitha kumi." These are some of the expressions that are referred to as the ipsissima verba, the very words of Jesus. Everything else in the gospel is a translation of what Jesus said, but there are certain words like Abba, Father, and Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and Talitha Kumi, that are the very words that Jesus pronounced at that moment. There followed in the gospel what I consider a lousy translation. Mark says, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." But when you study the origins of that word, Talitha, the original meaning was a little lamb, and it was used as an expression of endearment for children. So Jesus calls the sick woman daughter, and the dead child little lamb. Jesus raised her to life, and then he tells them to hush it up. Not very likely that that's going to happen. But Jesus tells them to get the girl something to eat. Nothing like coming back from the dead to work up a good appetite. This is such a beautiful gospel because it shows Jesus' compassion, his affection for the suffering, and his mercy in healing our wounds, and even overcoming death itself for us. What he asks is that we overcome our fears, that we walk by faith. We strengthen our faith by sharing it with others. That's what evangelization is about. Religious life came about in the church to give witness to the church's faith in the resurrection. When the period of intense persecution of the first generations of Christians subsided, the new martyrdom, the new witness, was that of consecrated celibacy. The religious renounce marriage and progeny because it's not necessary for everyone to have children to survive death. In Christ's resurrection, we are all called to live forever. Christ, who raised Lazarus and the daughter of Jairus, is he who is the resurrection and the life, and he will raise us up on the last day. We too will hear the words of affection and hope. Talitha Kumi. Your lives as religious brothers must be a sign of the church's faith in the resurrection. You are the sign of Jonah. For like Jonah in the belly of the whale, Jesus was in the bowels of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights and came forth alive, resurrected, glorious. All of your activities and ministries must proclaim to the world that Jesus is alive, that he loves us. He is with us to forgive us, to help us, to free us. We ask for the Lord's blessing on this house. May it be a house of hospitality, of joy, of prayer, and fellowship, gathered around the Eucharistic Lord. Your house here will be like Peter's house in Capharnaum, near the synagogue of the Mission Church. And from this place, may the witness of your consecrated life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, by your fraternity, your words, and your deeds, may you be indeed a brotherhood of hope, proclaiming to the whole world that Jesus Christ is alive and continues to call us to arise, to follow him, and to eat the bread of life. He is forever inviting us, Talitha Kumi, arise, little lamb.